Okay, we're live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a returning guest, a very special guest. His name is Vyzygoth, and he's done many radio interviews over the last 20 years. Beyond the Grassy Knoll, there were just a bunch of different shows, Think or Be Eaten. But we talked back on September 7th, 2021 about 9/11 and historical false flags. But today, we're going to talk about a different subject. We're going to talk about the communist takeover of America, its history, and he's going to talk more about that. So, Vyzygoth, are you there?
I'm there. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for agreeing to the interview. For people who may not be as familiar with your background as I am, can you talk about all of these kind of research? You've done different research pieces on different historical subjects, but you definitely did one on the communism. Can you talk about kind of your background and what led you to go down the rabbit hole on communist takeover America?
Well, you know, I'm a child of the 50s, and a lot of strange things went on at that time. Most people weren't paying attention. In fact, Angie, who you'll remember, and I were thinking about doing a book called While We Slept, because most folks that were building lives, like my parents, you know, had been involved with World War II. My father was unfortunate enough to catch Korea as well. And they just wanted to settle down and have decent lives. You know, it was like Levittown all over the world, for anybody who remembers Levittown. But, you know, it was like 2.3 kids, a two-family home, and a station wagon. So they weren't paying attention. They had enough of it. But a lot of stuff went down in back of World War II in Korea. And it may seem nonsensical, but I mean, like when my father used to drag me around to his softball games, inevitably we go back to the team's bar. They'd give me a Coke and a bunch of quarters to play pinball. But I heard stuff that I never forgot. And then, you know, you have questions, and you would ask your teachers about them, and they were like, well, you know, I don't know. It's just kind of like that way. Like, for instance, just one example, okay?
Sure.
Teacher, do we vote for president? Yeah. Okay, so why aren't we using a popular vote? Well, that's because you got to understand, it's like, wait a minute, one person, one vote. What's the problem? But the problem with the Electoral College from the very beginning was that it gave the powers that be, whoever that should be at any given epoch in history, a chance to rig the elections if it wasn't going out the way they wanted to. Right. And I'm just using that one as an example. Another one would be, and I'll leave it here. Okay, so what are lobbyists? And if that were done in any other kind of business, wouldn't that be called bribery?
Right. Yes.
But it's like, well, yeah, you got to understand. Anyway, it was stuff like that. But the stories I heard from my father's friends and teammates didn't always jive with what I was being taught about in history. And I never did forget it. And then as time went on, the questions only loomed larger, and there were more of them. And then obviously going to high school in the late 60s and going to college in the early 70s, I mean, all hell broke loose. And so you were looking for some kind of something to make sense of it. And then the question came in my head is like, are we really, the United States, all that we think we are? Or is there something more going on? Now, when I was growing up, I'll tell you what, they had some really scary PSAs about communism. And I don't know if you ever saw any of the footage of a Khrushchev banging his shoe on the desk.
I do. Yes. I remember that. Yes. Very vivid.
You know, and I'm like, who is this guy? And then they'd have these other commercials about this black, like, shadow of a hammer and sickle sprinting across Europe into the United States. And it was scary as hell, I tell you. And then I also lived through the Missiles of October situation, which was really high drama. Right. And we got all through it. But there were things that I wanted to know about that never really were answered sufficiently. So really, it was in the beginning of the 2000s. I thought, you know what? I'd like to do some research into this stuff. Let people talk, especially those who weren't actually giving a lot of access to publishing books, because there was a whole bunch of stuff going on there. And also on TV shows. And you realize that TV is rigged as well. Right. So that's how I started. And I guess it was because of the Informer. Do you remember him at all?
Yeah, very much. Yeah, I listened to some of those shows for sure.
I think all of them that I've done with him are still up on YouTube. And again, I didn't put any of them up. So, I mean, I'm not saying anything else except they're there. But my final question was, are we what we think we are? The United States, you know, the all-American good guys, good girls. And I came to realize no. But I also came to realize, and people may reject this because it's based on the Bible, but the macro look at all of this is really that Satan runs the show. And
Gotcha.
I'm only going to say this. In Luke 4:5, there's an interesting passage, I'm going to paraphrase, where Satan is tempting Christ. And at this point, he says to him, he shows him all the kingdoms of the world at one time. We might have talked about this last week, or last time we were together. And he says, they're mine to give to whomsoever I wish, if he would bow down and worship me. But what I got out of that, the Greek word kingdoms is basileia, which refers not to people, but to the government. And that's key, because the governments have never been good. They've only been as good as they had to be to get whatever they needed from their population. And when I realized that this whole thing is really rigged from the top down, then the last time I voted was 2000 because I realized it was a joke. I mean, we just do that because it gives us the feeling that we're really participating in a system that doesn't exist.
Agreed. Totally agree.
I mean, and you don't have to, of course, agree with me, but I mean.
Well, I mean, if you look at it, I think that they've probably been rigging the system for a long time, but more with these kind of electronic voting machines, they've been rigging everything for at least 20 years. And it was just much more obvious this 2020 election was just a more obvious expression of that.
I mean, I'm not a Republican, I'm not a Democrat, because I realize they're both two sides of a problem. And as you've seen in your lifetime, I think I can say this confidently, you've never seen such vitriol and hatred between the partisan parties as you have in your lifetime.
No, as now, no way.
I mean, nobody's paying attention to what's really happening. It's like, if our guys do it, it's okay. If your guys do it, it sucks. Right. And it's a joke. I mean, they're just watching a cat fight that just keeps going on and on and on. What I realized in 2000, our handlers, for the most part, which were the Rockefellers and the money parties and stuff like that. I mean, I'm not going to get into all that. But I mean, the people who run this country and run other countries don't run for office. You can bet your butt on that. So the thing is that they, I think, mistook George Bush's popularity. And when they saw that the election was in trouble, the magic Ohio situation occurred. Oh, that was the Florida situation. I'm sorry, that was 2000. Right. And I never saw anything like that in my life. I mean, I was watching Brokaw, every year. And all of a sudden, when it seemed like Bush was losing, there was this like knee-jerk reaction and this 2 feet on the brake thing, and said, "Oh, wait a minute, there's a problem in Florida." And it was early in the night. I mean, it was like dinner time, and I'm like, "What?" And of course, we saw what happened down there with the Chads and stuff like that. And I still have to laugh at what they said. Is like, of all the places where people wouldn't have problems with Chads, is in Florida, where everybody plays bingo. So
right. So they know it. You were in Florida at the time too, right?
Yeah, I was. Yeah. And the same thing happened in 2004. They got sloppy, and that's when they used Ohio. And I'm thinking to myself, well, they're never going to let that happen again, and they really didn't. You don't have to worry about Russians being involved in rigging an election because it gets done here.
Right. Well, that's the telling thing about 2020 is how little anybody in the establishment is blaming somebody outside of the country because they because it was all internal. It's probably. I mean, it always has been.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there was a reason for the Electoral College, but I tell you what, there was a reason to get rid of it too, but it never happened. And that's because it's a mechanism by which things can be turned around real quick. And as you just referred to too, the electronic voting is definitely a killer. And the exit polling, remember there were exit polls now when they do them now with early voting? Right. It's like they just want to find out the pulse of the country, so they have to rig it. They can do it earlier and a little smoother.
Right.
So
So true. No, they've been fixing it for a long time. So
yeah,
we're not free. We're not a free people. So that's, I mean, it goes into your theme. How free have we ever really been?
we've had it better than probably everybody on the face of the globe, but still, there's a price to pay for that, and I think you're going to see us paying for it soon. We were a rental from Europe through the Brits, and that day is coming to an end. We had ass-kicking military and all that kind of stuff, but like they used to say in the old gangster movies, we let you be as big as we wanted you to be.
Right.
And what the power center is really still in Europe, it's the European Holy Empire in its last manifestation. But
the U.S. is about to default on its debts. It cannot sustain itself. I hope people understand how serious of a precipice we're at, because once that baby defaults, the whole country is going to just deflate like a big fat balloon off the charts.
Yeah, this is very scary. I mean, we've had enough of these close calls, and then there's a time where I think it's really going to happen. But you also have to ask yourself, like in the last two wars, we had financial cataclysms before we had the war itself. You had the panic of, what was it, 07, I believe, before World War I. And then we had the Federal Reserve in 1913, which was to make sure that never happened again. So as soon as they came in,
right.
we had the Great Depression from 29 through 39. In fact, as we were crawling out of it, there was a fear that we weren't gonna.
Right.
And so voila, we have World War II and everybody's happy. And, there used to be all this talk at cocktail parties in the 50s and 60s. And there's two things I remember the adults saying. One is that they kidded tongue in cheek about the unseen hand,
Right.
that something going on there that just seems to work everything out. And they knew what they were talking about in a sense, but they didn't know what they were talking about. They suspected something else was going on, but they didn't want to have to deal with it. The other thing is, I don't know how many times I heard people say, what we need is a good war to make everything good. And that's the reason I bring this up, is because World War II came around, and actually, depending on who you read or what you read, it was World War II that really got us out of the Depression because of the hyperproduction for the war effort.
Yeah, we came out the victor, really. We became out the manufacturing victor, while Europe and Russia were, sheared off at the waist, at least, if not lesser than that. So the U.S. was really the victor after that.
Well, what was interesting is, I'm trying to think when it was now. I remember when it was. Believe it or not, it was a Penthouse article. I didn't buy those magazines. I just read the articles.
Sure. Of course, like all of us.
It was I think it was May 75, and I had the article up on one of the websites. It had just been declassified and was called The Unholy Alliance. And in it, in fact, it was my boss who bought the Penthouses, and I was very close to him. I was working at the university at the time when I was finishing off my bachelor's in the athletic department. And he gave it to me. He's going, read this. Do you think this is true? And I read it. And I'm like, holy crap. In it, it stated that the Germans were in debt to like DuPont, Ford, and General Motors for giving them what they needed to help their war effort with vehicles and rubber and all that other stuff. And I'm like, are you kidding me? Seriously, this is what happened? It was 75 or 76. I think it was 75.
Right.
And then I read that, and it was so unsettling. But I mean, the guy had gotten recently released information, that stated it all. And I forget, it was Himmler or Goebbels that said, we cannot thank the United States enough. And then you heard the stories too, I'm sure, about Chamberlain, who was the Prime Minister of England, having ownership in munitions in Germany. So,
I've heard all those stories. I heard that they didn't bomb certain cities because it was owned by foreign investment. So cities were chosen only for if they had native industrial capacity. Yeah,
what's interesting about that, and I know we're getting away from like the communist thing, because the communist thing is just another charade, but
But I think it shows how the money rules the world,
Yeah.
and that's the under thing. So the ideology almost isn't. It is important, but it's usually about entrenched elites and the continuance of familial power. And really, I mean, if you see it that way, if Satan rules the world, he's pulling the strings of these people. I mean, the U.S. is really, I think, from its after maybe Adams, all these people are related. They're the people who are becoming presidents are. I mean, yeah. So.
It's all in the family.
All in the family, right?
Well, here's what happened. This is a pretty decent anecdote. If I've said it, and then stop me. But I had a meeting in D.C. in '76, and it was 3 parties, and the mutual party hadn't gotten there yet. So here I am with this stranger, and he was a veteran from World War II, and it's 1976. Vietnam kind of like was still there, but fading. And so he asked me, he goes, well, what did you think about the Vietnam War? I mean, I don't know what to say because I don't want this guy taking my head off,
Right.
I just said to him, sir, I still don't understand what it was all about. And he says, you're absolutely right. And he tells me a story about being in the infantry in Germany in the waning days of World War II. And like everybody has heard about Tokyo Rose and how she would bait the Allies and stuff like that. Like, American, your wife is home getting screwed by somebody else and all that stuff. He said that's what the same thing happened in Germany, that the Germans would get on and bait them. And
yeah, there was Lord Haha was his name. He ended up getting hung. He was an English guy. You ever hear of Lord Haha?
No.
That was the one. No, he was a turncoat. He was a Nazi sympathizer who did a lot of the radio programs for Germany. Yes.
So this guy is saying that they heard a broadcast where it says, "You dumb Americans, you're not bombing certain facilities because you can't find them, you idiots." And this went on for a while. And then one day it went down the trenches that, in fact, the Allies did bomb those facilities, but they did it with garbage and furniture because they weren't allowed to blow them up. Right. They just wanted to shut them up. The Germans said, yeah, we know they're there, but we can't do anything about it. So what that person said to me, and I mean, this guy's like probably in his late 50s at the time. He said to me, he goes, that all of us in the trenches said there's only one objective we have, and that's to get back safe. Screw all this stuff. And then there were stories about IT&T that was going to sue America for war damages. It may, in fact, have done that. I'm not sure. But this is what we're looking at. I mean, there's a lot of people who were obviously under the boot heel of fascism, and we're glad to see Americans come into town. I don't disagree with that at all. Have no problem believing that. But the reason they fight wars is to create money, and that's all there is to it.
Right. It's a huge wealth creation and transference schemes. It's like Vietnam was really what they did. They drew it out for 10 years, right? Under a psychopath like LBJ. Yeah.
I can tell you that, again, being a kid, I was 9 years old. I was dragged to an adult party, and everybody was talking about we're in Laos, and I never even heard like what Laos was. I mean, that didn't even seem like a country. I mean, too many vowels in it, and too few. Right. So I'm like, okay, so we're going to fight Laos. So how long should this take? An hour? Oh, and it lasted for 10 years. And then you realize why. And there is a great, great documentary, which I did on one of the shows and did a lot of the sound bites, called Hearts and Minds, a documentary about Vietnam. I believe you can see it on YouTube. And you hear some of the ex-soldiers talking about what was going on. And they realized also this was about making money. In fact, they had a clip of Eisenhower at the very beginning of the documentary where he says, I guess we got to kind of be in this if we want to maintain the tin and tungsten that we value so much. And I'm like, well, what? And the other thing is they had a French emissary on who was speaking his native tongue. And he was talking about John Foster Dulles, who was the Secretary of State at the time. His brother was head of the CIA, Allen. And he's looking at the camera. And in English, I'll just say he said this. He goes, and John Foster Dulles because the French were in French Indochina, okay, before we got in there.
Right.
He goes, and John Forsyth Dulles offered us 2 atom bombs. And he says, not 1, but 2. And looking like, what in the world is wrong with John Forsyth Dulles in America? So it's that kind of thing that's on the record now. And it just adds to the fact that, look, we're all propagandized in the education system with the media, okay?
Right.
We're still a better nation than so many others. But the end is not over for us, and we're going to find it very bitter when it does happen. But the point is that Jesus doesn't love us any more than any other nation, because he says in Scripture, no one seeks after us, not after him, not one. Well, if he's talking about people, then what in the world are nations about? They don't, I mean, we talk about being churchy, but we really aren't. You know, the Pilgrims and Puritans came here, like, big deal. But we had to be basically programmed in the public school system into believing that God loved us more than everyone else. And I'll tell you, there's a website, Rex Curry, that's CURRY.net. He's a lawyer out of Tampa. And I don't know if you remember this, William, or not, but they show you what the original Pledge of Allegiance salute was.
It's a Nazi salute, right?
It's the fascist salute.
Fascist salute, right?
The Rome
Yeah.
salute, yeah.
They still have the fascist symbol in Congress. I mean, the fasces is there, so they haven't taken it down. Yeah. So.
Well, and I have to laugh. And all I'm saying is that we're not unlike any other country, you know, except that we were richer. I mean, we weren't all out about God. I mean, the rotunda of the Capitol dome, and I forget what the term is for that, is ringed with
cupola.
Nope, don't know. Can't remember what it is now. If you're going to look for it, you can. But
okay.
there's this like, you know, Michelangelo painting of every single pagan god there is. Neptune's there, and Nineveh's there, and all that. They're called, I know what it is, the apotheosis. That's what it's called.
Right.
So I'm saying to myself, here you got a pagan symbol, which is the dome, which is a female breast, inside of the obelisk, Washington Monument, which is supposedly the penis.
Penis of Horus, right?
Huh?
Penis of Horus. Isn't it the penis of Horus or Set?
Oh, I don't know. I just know
yeah.
the Masons built it, and it's 555 feet, which comes out to 6,660 inches.
Sure.
6, 0.
It's all coincidence, Keith. All coincidence.
I know. So the thing is that, I mean, you either get over it or you don't. I can't say I don't back soldiers. I mean, they think they're doing the right thing. I get all that. It's very, very trying to not back them because they think they're doing the right thing. But once I realized, and this is where I'm going with this whole thing about the informer also in communism, and then the whole thing is a setup. It's always been a setup. And that's the way it is. That's the way of the world, whether you can take it or not. That's just how it is. And I understood that. And really, when I got to that point with the informer talking about the real Constitution and such, then I just realized that this is how it is. And you go on with your life. But to get all wet about how it's so Christian, so merciful, it's like, no, it's just business. That's all it is business.
Business, yeah, at the top. I would totally agree with that.
Now, I had sent you links, which you may post, right?
I can show them on screen now, or I can put them in the show notes, whatever you like.
Yeah, put them in the show notes, I think.
Okay.
I think it would be best. But the thing is that the one book that really struck me was Antony C. Sutton's Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution. I mean, the West set up communism. There were 3 laboratories, if you will, on the world, on the earth. There was socialism, which sprang out of Europe for the most part, and there was capitalism here, and there was communism in Eurasia, Russia and spreading west, or that would be east, I guess. And the thing is that we set up the Bolsheviks, and it talks about giving Lenin 20 million in gold.
Right. The
Trotsky
famous, the infamous train to St. Petersburg, right?
Yeah.
You ever heard that story?
Yes. And then there's the other one too about Trotsky, being programmed in Queens.
Right. He lived with Schiff. He was a protege of the Schiff banking family. So
right. And so
lived with them for a long time, right?
And then when he goes to make his trip to Europe, he goes by ship, and the Canadians catch him, and both the American and British government said let him go. They're like, okay, So there you go. I mean, it was all started here. So Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution and the Best Enemy Money Can Buy are two books by Antony C. Sutton. There's links to them where people can read them for free, and they can see how it was all set up by the West. The West set up communism.
And Anthony Sutton was part of the Hoover Institution. He did a lot of his research there. He
Yeah.
wasn't a slouch. He wasn't some guy in some rural place just hammering on a typewriter. He was like a legitimate researcher. I think he do another one on Skull and Bones or something like that too. He wrote a lot of different stuff.
Yeah, I think he did Skull and Bones, although somebody else did a book on that as well.
Yeah, Milligan did one.
Yeah, Milligan did, right. But he also did FDR and Wall Street. And that's why one of the biggest farces is, and I think we've all heard this, Jules Archer wrote a book about the supposed coup by Smedley Butler.
Wars of Racket.
You remember that? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, Smedley D. Butler. But when I researched that, and I got a book of his letters and a lot of writings, he was acting as a double agent. He wasn't saying much. He wasn't taking any money, but he was listening to what you would call, I guess at that time, like the crypto Americans who wanted a new government. And interestingly, they wanted to set it up in Denver, which is more than a clue. And they were pro-German, not because they liked the Nazis. They just were pro-German. And so Butler engaged them, went to this camp in Maryland where they supposedly bivouacked the army, and there was nobody there. And then he went to Congress, to a subcommittee, and the New York Times covered it. And he went on for 3 days about what was going on. And the Senate subcommittee or whatever it was said, no, there's nothing here. And Butler's like, huh? So they've got Butler as being this head of a rebel army. It never was. And the reason I believe it happened, and this is my feeling, and that is FDR was not a popular president. In 1933, he was about to unleash the Banking Act and a whole lot of other socialist programs, which were supposed to be a Band-Aid to the Depression. I get that. But I think what was happening was they engendered some kind of sympathy for FDR as being a president that was going to be overthrown. And that's what did it, because people did not want, there was an anti-war sentiment in World War I. There was even a bigger one in World War II. And then they wanted everybody to turn in their hard money, which meant gold and silver coins. And that wasn't really popular with a lot of people. And remember, at this time, there wasn't a mass media.
Right.
They weren't inundated 24/7 with propaganda. They just used common sense and talked to each other and said, this isn't making sense to me. So Archer's book, I think, revived this feeling that there was going to be a coup against Roosevelt, led by Wall Street bankers. But what was ridiculous about it is that FDR was Wall Street. Both sides of his family were Wall Street. He had an office down in Wall Street. So it was just, Butler, when he was done with it, didn't die long after. And I really feel, I don't know why he did this, but, Forrestal also came out and talked about corruption in the government and wound up a suicide, I think, in Bethesda. And not long after Butler did his thing, he goes to a VA in Pennsylvania where he lives, Philadelphia, I think, and he doesn't last long either. You catch my drift?
Yeah. Yes. Yes,
All right.
I do.
So again, my point is that we prop up and we make these boogeymen, as we do to this very day, so that money can be made, war can be made, and eventually we're going to come to this one world government, which has always been sought of. And that's why I bring it up too, because what we're headed for is this new feudalism, which is something I found strikingly common in a lot of the literature written by futurists. I mean, whether it's H.G. Wells and The Open Conspiracy or George Bernard Shaw or whatever, we're all talking about a new feudalism. They want just enough of us around to do the wet work, and that's it.
Right. Crowley too. Love feudalism.
Yes. Yeah, and who was his counterpart in Germany?
There was Ewers, there was Hannison, there were a couple of people. I don't know, maybe.
Vieth.
What was his name?
I don't know. Oh man,
I don't know who Crowley's counterpart really was, but there are a lot of occultists floating around the Nazi Party, if not Hitler himself. Himmler had like 12,000 occult books. Babelsberg. So these guys, there were a lot of them around. Rosenberg was one.
What do you mean, the American couple?
No, I think that Alfred Rosenberg was kind of like one of the ideologues in the early Nazi Party who wrote, kind of mythological kind of political stuff.
All right, the guy I'm thinking about is Dietrich
Eckhart. Yeah.
There you go. So, but I mean, I read a book by Bob Rosio, and this is the first time I had ever seen it. I actually went to his church when my wife and I were living in Pittsburgh. Didn't realize that he was a historian. But he wrote a book whose title escapes me. But in it, it talks about how Hitler had I don't know how many Buddhist monks doing their little thing in the bunker.
Right. Yeah. They all were found dead, right, in the bunker. Yeah.
Exactly.
They were Tibetan, if I remember correctly.
That was what?
They were from Tibet. They were Tibetan Buddhists.
Exactly. Right. So it's what is that about? So there you go. I mean, everybody's messing with the mojo, and what we're told about good and bad is not necessarily the case. But again, this is just the way the world is. And I don't know, did I ever bring up to you something I thought was really interesting, that the Russians sent their fleets to the United States?
No, I don't remember that. What's that story?
Right. I had long heard a rumor. This is going back to the early days of the internet when there wasn't a lot on there. And I even emailed some Russian guy or something like that. I said, can you confirm the fact that the Tsar in the 1860s sent his fleets to the United States? And he kind of said, yeah, but he didn't have anything to back it up. Well, then as the internet grew, I found the information. In fact, there's a book on archive.org called Lincoln and the Russians that chronicle a lot of this. But I also went into the New York Tribune, and I found that in October 1863, the Tsar sent his Atlantic fleet to New York City and then later down to Virginia, to deep water ports. And he sent his Pacific fleet to San Francisco. In fact, out by you, there's the, I guess, California Quarterly or something. It's a historical magazine. And I got a reprint from them to begin with. But that's when I went to the Tribune on archive.org. I'm sorry, no, the Tribune is on chroniclingamerica.loc.gov. They digitize newspapers that have gone back as far as the 18th century.
Interesting.
So I'm looking around for this, and don't you know that the Tsar, in fact, did do that? I think it was Nicholas at the time, but he's the one I believe was assassinated, or right around that time.
There was an attempt assassination on the first Nicholas, and then the second Nicholas was murdered by the Bolsheviks, right? 1917.
Then this may be the first, because obviously it's in the 1860s.
But that actually, just as a side note, that was actually something that involved Lenin, because it was Lenin's brother who tried to throw a bomb at the earlier Tsar. And so then he got tortured by the, Tsarist police state and killed. And so that was something that Lenin had a gripe about. So when all the history turned, he did end all of the Romanovs.
Well, they never played nice with the rest of Europe. They were always a thorn in the Rothschild side. But here's the reason behind this. Now, again, this is a front page story in the Tribune, and it carried on for a couple of weeks. The reason we're told that they were sent here was to stop the Confederate blockade runners from being able to move stores amongst the states, and that the United States ships were having a hard time trying to, well, frankly, stop them.
Mhm.
And that may be true, but then there's something bigger that was at foot, and that was the Russians had just lost to Britain and France in the Crimean War. That was like, what, 1856, I think. And it was the first time that those two nations actually were allies to one another. That's how much they hated each other. But the Russians were looking for a warm water port. They wanted to get out through the Black Sea into the Mediterranean, and the Brits and the French said, we can't let that happen. So what occurred was, the Tsar was concerned that the Brits would come up and lay for the Atlantic fleet while they were ice locked up, by Archangel. Okay.
Mhm.
So he knew that if he stayed there, he'd be scuttled as soon as the spring broke. So what he did was he's got his ships out on the open water because they knew they could beat the Brits and the French on the open water, that they had the better navy, and they wanted payback for losing the Crimean War. So the Atlantic fleet did come out to New York. The Pacific fleet went out to San Francisco, and that's where they stayed. I mean, you almost had the First World War because of that. So there was a lot of parties involved, but I had to laugh because it was the Russians who actually were allies to Lincoln in that Civil War.
Right. Interesting.
Yeah. And like I said, you can read that in Lincoln and the Russians, and it's available on Chronicle.
There it is. It's right there on YouTube. If people are on YouTube, you can check it out. Check out the title. Albert A. Waldman is the author's name.
Okay. Yeah, I think it was written in the early 50s or so. But the thing is, I mean, that's the book, but I came upon the articles themselves beforehand. And I mean, what I had to laugh at is that they gave like a ticker tape parade for the Russians when they got there. And it was either in New York or San Francisco where the sailors jumped in to fight this huge fire and had casualties and everything else. So, I mean, it's funny that when I think of that movie, the Russians are coming, it's like, no, the Russians have been here. So,
right. Well, the Russians were actually here a lot earlier. Alaska was a Russian property. If you're from Northern California, the Russian River is named the Russian River because that's how far the Russians got. Well, they got almost north of San Francisco.
Well, that's interesting, too, because that's the reason we bought Alaska. Seward's Folly was actually payment to the Russians for their service. We paid them $1 million for Alaska because of their fleets being sent here.
Interesting. Right. It turned out to be a damn good deal.
Yeah, I guess. But anyway, so we were not enemies with Russia. But when we grew up in school, obviously things changed, and we were told they were the big bad bear and all. They
still are. They still are. I mean, they're still blamed for everything. The Russians are involved in the elections. Clinton's. I mean, Trump's hanging out with the Russians, so they're still the big bad baddie. They still are, at least according to the left.
Well, yeah. I mean, but the thing is, yeah. You do what you have to. Well, look. I mean, we're going to have a war sooner or later. And it's going to take place in the Eurasian continent. And like I think I talked to you about once upon a time, in Brzezinski's book, The Grand Chessboard, he says the United States would be unwise to agitate an axis of Iran, China, and Russia. And I mean, being written in 1994, I read it in 2002, and I'm like, why are we even talking about this? Nobody's mad at each other. I mean, the Afghanistan thing was over with. The hostage thing. So I'm like, why is he saying it? But it goes back to what a lot of us believe, and that is the insiders. And there's more like Brzezinski and Kissinger, these guys who are never elected, but they're always in DC. You know what I mean?
Right.
And that goes for, what's his name? Who were the two that hung around Bush?
Let's see. It was Bolton and who's the other one? Which is the other one? I don't know.
It's horrible.
But they're all CFR people, right? So that's Rockefeller's influence on the entire government through administrations. And the fact that Trump actually put Bolton in his cabinet or let him in the White House tells you a lot about how the system really works and who Trump was beholden to. Like, he put some of the biggest scoundrels like Bolton in earshot of what he was doing. It's crazy.
Yeah, and I'm still trying to hang on that name because I mean he's the one with the glasses, Rumsfeld. There it is.
Rumsfeld, yeah.
But what I had to laugh about is that when I was working at the university, I would get a lot of information that I would not have gotten if I was just Joe, Mo, emailing, because I had a university email, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they obviously thought I was probably a professor or something like that. But I used to get the CFR rosters. And then while this Clinton thing was going on with Ken Starr, I realized the two of them are in the CFR. And I'm like, so this whole thing is a joke too, because, he's going after Clinton. No, he's not. I mean, the two of these guys are brothers under the skin on the CFR. So how in the world could one prosecute the other honestly? It was a joke.
Joke, right.
And, and to go along with a couple other things also, again, with the links that I have to the books. I mean, we don't have to go through it now, but you take a look at the 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto.
Right.
And seven of them at least have already been realized. What we're looking at now is not just a communist way of life. We're looking at totalitarianism. All right. You can call it socialism. You can call it communism. You can call it whatever ism you want. The bottom line, it's just like they said, it's a new feudalism, it's totalitarianism, and we're all going to live under the same edicts. So here we are. I mean, they give you one, a graduated income tax. Well, gee.
Ding, done, right.
Abolition of private property, which is pretty much there. And the
We're
other
getting
thing
closer, yeah.
I mean, because you don't own anything anyway. I mean, great that you paid off the mortgage, but don't pay your
mortgage. The 30-year mortgage is one of the biggest finance scams ever invented in the history of all humanity.
Yes,
no doubt. Then nobody pays down their actual, mortgage. They're just paying a rent. It's a form of rent to a bank, which goes back to what is it? The 5 of the Communist Manifesto: centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. So, right?
Absolutely. And number 6 is centralization of the means of communication and transportation in the hands of the state, which is why we have an FAA and an FCC and an ICC. And you can argue that, well, that has to be necessary. I'm not even arguing that. What I'm saying is that we're all the same. We just call it something different. We're all becoming the same kind of government animal.
Right.
And, right. And another thing I think about too is that with the school system, it talks about what does it say? I think that's the 10th one.
10th, free education for all children in public schools. So that sounds like a nice little benefit, but the opposite side of the coin is a total nightmare.
Well, it led to once in 79, and Charlotte Isabert was on. Remember Charlotte?
Yeah, very well.
Okay. Charlotte was talking about in 79 when they brought in the Department of Education. That was it for school systems, because they lost their independence. From the beginning of this country, towns took care of their own education system. They didn't do anything that was centralized. Right. When you centralize it, everybody gets the same thing. So if they get, and people talk about what is the thing that everybody's raging about now?
Well, it's either critical race theory or flat out child porn in schools. One or the other. I don't know which one, or both. I don't know.
Or outcome-based education or whatever it is. I mean,
outcome-based, right? That's another one.
Yeah, and I mean, I was a teacher for 2 years, and I realized that, and that's another thing where I said, like, I can't do this. I can't do it. I mean, you're just getting fed propaganda, and there's no room to question. And the thing that struck me most too, when I was working at the university, when I went to college in the early 70s, the professors there instigated. They wanted you to argue. They wanted you to debate. And that was a healthy thing. But when I looked at the people that were teaching in school at the time, the professors there in 2000s, I mean, if you disagree with them, you were risking the drop of a grade. And I mean, I had more than one student, because I worked in the library. So I mean, I was a resource person, and everybody came to you for something. Okay. And they would tell me this stuff, and I'm like, holy mackerel, how things have changed. It's like, if you don't agree with me, you're not going to get a good grade.
That's how you adapt. I can tell you that's how you adapt to these schools, is to exactly, regurgitate what they tell you. That's how I adapted. I've been through those things. That's how you get ahead. You don't have a choice. If you're the ones grading you, it's not a proper kind of challenging environment. At least and I was at schools that were law school was much more on the right, still had indoctrination, man, big time.
So, and there's a book out by Leonard Peikoff. I didn't put that in the links, called The Ominous Parallels, The End of Freedom in America. And he goes on, as Rosio did, about Dewey, who's the father of modern education. And he was a stone communist. And again, like I said, I don't care. But the thing is, it certainly wasn't of American values as far as I knew them. So, I mean, it was very socialistic. In fact, you know what? Even Plato stated, and I think this is where it comes from with Hillary's book, but what Plato stated that two things. One, the democracy was the third worst out of four forms of government, that it really was mob rule. And he said, secondly, that the children should be taken from their parents and raised by the philosopher kings in the countryside. So here you have somebody who is a acolyte of that, Dewey, in the education system early on. The one link I gave you on School of Darkness from Bella Dodd is extremely poignant. She was Italian born. She was handicapped. She came to the United States. She believed in the communist ethos. She was a school teacher. And then she realized who ran the show. Once she realized who the big wigs were that were running it, she got out. So that's an interesting story. And it just goes to show you, too, that, I mean, they've been at it for a while. This book was published in 1954, right? Right. That's what I mean. I mean, they've been at the youth for a long, long time. You say one thing, you do another. And I think that's a good read if anybody wants to learn about the system, and somebody who was a diehard member and then just said, I can't do this. And she left. Right. And then, and just to bring up the Informer also, I was hoping that the United States was different than everything else. And I saw the Informer. And one thing I did, William, and I think you fall under this category in the very early years of your work, I would look for people who weren't very well published or broadcasted, that had something to say, but just weren't kind of getting the microphone or anything like that. Mm-hmm. And because, I mean, not because they were supposedly just obscure, it's because they had something to say and it wasn't getting out, intentionally or not, I don't know. All right. And when I found the Informer, he had been on like 3 times, I think, beforehand, but he had taken down the Constitution and, did a great job. And I had him on. And that's when I realized that we're no different than anyone else. That's kind of when it was it for me, because I came to a point where I found what I was looking for. It wasn't what I was hoping for, but reality is reality. And I realized that we're not going to stop this thing. We're going to have to navigate it however one chooses to, but the cavalry ain't coming for us, folks, this time. I hate to say it, but it's not.
Yeah, there's no cavalry. Where's that cavalry, supposedly? I mean, don't hold your breath. I don't know where that's going to take place.
Well, it's cavalry, but not cavalry, right?
Right. It's on from cavalry is probably more accurate, right?
Right. And the other thing, too, is, and I'm not going to go into this, but there's a lot of interesting stuff that did take place in the 50s. And I don't know if you're familiar with these names, but George Kennan.
Yeah, the Kennan wrote that one paper, right, about kind of containing Soviet Union or something like that. Was that it? Wasn't it a foreign policy paper?
What? Yeah, he and Leo Strauss and James Burnham were supposed to be Cold War warriors, but it's really questionable whether they were or not. Burnham's, I guess, opus is the managerial revolution. And one of the things that's going to come along with what uh, Eric Blair warned us about.
Right. George Orwell.
Yeah, is that, fascism and totalitarianism, besides its nastiness and its booheel being grounded in our faces, is if you want to see bureaucrats come out of the walls, man, holy mackerel. And that's why I bring up Burnham and the managerial revolution. I mean, you're going to have more bureaucrats watching everything. And before we go, what I also wanted to bring up, so by the way, one last thing about the Informer. Mm-hmm. You can look for the Informer on YouTube, and the shows are up there. Okay, so right. I think that thing is the most extant that I have of anything I've done. But there was something I came upon too in 2002. It's called Understanding and Solving Environmental Problems in the 21st Century. Co-authors Constanza and Jurgensen, published in 2002. The reason I bring it up is that somebody sent me something the other day about the social credit score. Are you hip to this?
Very much so. At least it's functioning in Russia, in China right now, but it's kind of here. It just hasn't been solidified here, but it is here.
Yeah, Canada's ahead of the game too. We've heard this thing coming about the digital wallet and the global reset. But when I was reading this book by Constanza and Jurgensen, they had published these indices where everything you did in your life was going to be measured and quantified, and it was going to come out with a quote score. So what I could say is this: when you see the smart meters that have been put out, you probably have one. I've seen them, come out here.
Sure.
It's more efficient. I get that, but besides even like the radiation thing, there's going to come a time where a family unit of so many children are going to be allowed or allotted so many units of energy, water, etc. And if you exceed that, you're going to be fined or penalized or whatever.
Right.
This is all the beginning of this whole social credit stuff and this whole thing that's going to happen across the world. Everything is going to be quantified. And that's just the way it's going to be. And it's here in front of them. They're going to give us reasons why it has to be.
Right.
And I'm not against the environmental movement, but the radical environmental movement is being used, just as COVID is, to rein in people.
Yes, no doubt. It's just an excuse to keep this agenda moving forward.
Yeah, and it's all encompassing. And I can't even watch TV at times because if I see COVID one more time, I'm going to hurl.
Right.
Just enough of it. Okay.
Oh, there's propagandizing people like crazy because there's alternates to this whole COVID thing they're definitely not talking about. So you really can see the similarities by the big state, even in this so-called capitalist system, which really in action isn't that capitalistic. If you have 40 or 45% of the people directly benefiting from the government, it's not pure capitalism. But what you do see in the similarities between communism and the American state is the aggregation of state power and the totalitarianism of its effect upon the individual. And it really is 1984. People say it's 1984, Brave New World, Fahrenheit 451, all kind of melded in together. But I think we've been boiled in the fishbowl. Boiled in the boiling water because it's credible. People are being censored. I got kicked off of YouTube. No response, no credible even response. Why? And the excuses were baloney. And they lied to me for 4 months and said it was a suspension when it was really a termination. So very evil stuff is happening. And I really don't even swear. And they accuse me of, I could probably sue them, but I should sue them just for principle because they accuse me of bullying somebody. Like, who am I bullying? So it's a bad situation in the U.S. And I think people, if they really saw what they were at clearly, they would be really terrified presently right now. In the
it's funny you should say that because do you remember the Uticans?
Yeah, of course.
All right. They actually went out and held conferences. Not huge, but whether it was at the public library or stuff like that. But they actually went out and did something,
Right.
And I remember talking to them and they would say, with regard to 9/11, that they could break it down and people would understand and get it. But then they said there's a glazed look that comes over their eyes when they go to the next level.
Right.
And they realize, well, if that's true, then what does that say about our government? And that's when it gets hairy. And I can understand people feeling that way because I do too, especially at this time in my life. It's like you realize, you know, it's going to hit the fan.
I don't know how it can't, honestly, because the government of the U.S. is pushing its citizens, constantly pushing and pushing and pushing. So at a certain point, it's like you're not free if you're stealing the elections, and we don't have a free voice. How legitimate is the government, right?
Yeah, it's not.
Not outright criminal. So
yeah,
we're in a difficult. I'm sure people are whispering about this at bars. I know. Yeah, I mean, I've had some conversation with these 80-year-old ladies. I mean, you wouldn't believe the kind of stuff they say. I'm like, damn, you're gonna get freaking, thrown in jail. Like, people are not happy. They're very not happy, but they can't express. So the outlets for, solving problems through legal means or change in the government, that doesn't happen. That's a problem. I would just say that you're just putting kindling on a fire. This is the government itself. So yeah, I just don't see it.
Well, I thought what was interesting is that, I mean, I never gave this guy much thought at all, but I did remember one thing, and that is from World War II with Mussolini. And he said, beware of corporate fascism. And I'm like, what do you mean corporate fascism? I mean, they're corporations, they're companies, they don't do anything, But then I realized, no, lunkhead, what happens is you have no government, and it is the corporations that are running the show. The people who run this country don't run for office. They just use the people in Congress and all of DC just as, frankly, script readers and punching bags. Get mad at the politicians, not at the people who really do it. So, to me, it started all with the robber barons in the United States.
Right. They always found politicians to be their fronts, right? So they always found somebody. Even Wilson himself. If you look at that, I just am reading a book right now called Kleptocracy, but he was always kind of a front man. Well, that's a different book, actually. This one was a different title, but it was really showing that Wilson was a front for the bankers from the beginning, and that he was put in as a so-called progressive, and that he thought that the Federal Reserve System was going to be a benefit to the people, which is hard to believe. Like, he was a dupe all the way through.
No, and what's funny too is that the Federal Reserve Act is unconstitutional.
Right. It says that the bank has to be run by the people, right, in the Constitution.
Well, it was Congress's job to regulate money.
Money, right.
And they gave that power to the Federal Reserve, and that was what was unconstitutional. And of course, as soon as they did that, in answer to never having a panic of like I said, 1907, we had the Depression, so it's like, nice work.
Right.
So, and
there were all kinds of banking things going on right there at the turn of the century too, right? So.
Well, yeah, I mean, of course there is. I mean, that was as draconian as it gets. And let me not forget this one, but I gave you a link called Towards Soviet America, a book by William Z. Foster. And the thing that struck me about this book, now it was published, I think, in 1932. So you figure he wrote it in 1931. I don't know if he was the head of the American Communist Party at the time he wrote it. It may have been Earl Browder, but Browder got overthrown and Foster took his place. And then Bella Dodd talks about that in her book as well. But in the book, Foster kind of like laughingly says, you people think that this federalization that's going on under FDR, is something other than, he called it Sovietization.
Interesting.
Yeah. So he just laughed. He says, yeah, you call federalization, it's Sovietization.
Right.
It's the same damn thing. It's expansion of government, and that's all there is to it. And he was right. But what makes me crack up is that he wrote it, really before Roosevelt even did anything. So how did that happen? And that's, like I said, that's online. You can read it. But here's another good thing about talking about freedoms and rights. I first got the book before it was available on archive.org. And man, people got to check out that site for books that you'll never see anymore in circulation. It's just a treasure trove. Where was I going with this?
Well, I'm just saying, we're at about an hour. Is there anything you'd like to add? Anything I missed? You got a question from the audience from Barbara. She says, does our guest see any way out of this?
All right. First of all, this is what I wanted to finish off with.
Okay, good.
I got towards Soviet America sent to me in interlibrary loan, which in most institutions now is gone, and that's interesting. The other thing I wanted to say was I was fortunate enough to be in the library at the time that there were 3 donations by history professors to us. So a lot of stuff that never got on the shelves, I got to read, and I tell you, that opened my eyes as well. The thing about Towards Soviet America was that some other communist group, student group, didn't like Foster's book, so they ripped out so many pages, and I'm like, so where are we? You know, is this what freedom is about? You allow people to say things that you don't agree with. Right. And Barbara, I mean, all right, I got to say it plain. Without Jesus Christ, I don't know what I do. If you're looking for a solution politically, ain't going to happen. And I wish it was better news, but like I said, sometimes the cavalry doesn't come, and this is one of them. Americans are loath to believe that because, you know, we've never seen a bad time per se. It always happens to somebody else. But I mean, the thing you have to do is just, I mean, it's all about family and relationships. And I mean, if you don't believe in the Lord, you know, okay, that's fine. But that's the only way I'm getting through with it, because I tell you, reading the Bible, I understood that the New World Order is of Satan. And one other thing, if I can, is there any other questions out there? Or
let's see. What else is there? Jesus is the way. No, please go ahead and make your concluding remarks.
All right. The last thing was this. There was something that struck me also strange, and that was there's legislation that's on the Hill. It really never has gone anywhere, but it's never disappeared. And it's the Universal National Service Act. That harkens back to Trotsky's industrial armies, compulsory labor service. And that can be found in his book, Terrorism and Communism, a reply to KAUTSKY. It's kind of dry reading because, I mean, Trotsky goes on and on and on and on and on. But the thing is, the idea of what is coming soon is that if we go into a depression, and I think you heard this from Biden somewhat, that there would be this kind of like new WPA to put people to work. But it's compulsory service. Look up Universal National Service Act. I think I gave you the link to that.
I do. I'm trying to find it.
It's been around since like 2003, and it's been changed. They used to call it the Universal Military Service Act, and they yanked out military. But it was compulsory 2-year service for all people from 18 to 25. They even had that number up to 45, if you can believe that or not. And again, all I'm saying is that all of us are becoming the same thing. All governments are melding into this one kind of entity that will be ruled by a one world government. And as I said, to me, you know, the more I got into this and the more I read scripture, I realized that this is what's coming. This is Satan's takeover.
Right. It conforms or comports with Revelation, right?
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. And, you know, like I said, I hate sharing this kind of stuff because, I mean, it's not like, you know, ha. But, well, I mean, sit back. It's the way it is. And, you know, the more they talk about freedom in America, the fewer you get.
Yeah, no, it's a scary situation. I mean, I think what it is kind of like this statism, authoritarianism, fascism, communism, plus the new technocratic environment comes into probably the greatest tyrannical system, global system. Back in the days where there were problems in certain countries, people could flee, they could become refugees,
right?
They could find succor somewhere else. In the future, there's no way out. Imagine being no way out. Like you would have to go to Madagascar or something.
Yeah, there's nowhere to hide. That's for sure. There's not two ways about it.
Yeah, it's scary.
And, well, yeah, I mean, it is. But, you know, it's funny because with Orwell and Huxley, those books should have been taught in poli-sci.
Right.
Not in English, because everybody thinks they're allegories and just like, you know, futurism gone wild. But, I mean, whether you like Huxley or not, and I think you would say that Orwell is probably the more likable than the other
personality. Yeah, no doubt.
Yeah, because I mean, when Huxley talked, it was so, you know, kind of like highbrow and stuff. But the point is they both were right. And they both knew something was happening. And certainly Orwell knew what was happening. They also all were around London in the early part of the 1900s. And that's where a lot of stuff got put in place. And the last book I'll mention to you is Lord of the World by Robert U. Benson. What I find interesting about that is that he foresees in that a Asian invasion of the West that can only be stopped by America. And he wrote that before Orwell wrote 1984.
Interesting.
Lord of the World, that can also be found on archive.org. My only point is that this has been going on for a long time. The plans have been laid in for a century, and no doubt a half century here, by the architects of those who want global rule. So ain't pretty, but it's true.
Yeah, it's coming into view, kind of like George Bush said, right? It's kind of coming into view. Let's see if I can find this. I can't find the link to it. Lord of the World, there it is. Complete text from Project Gutenberg. So you can find Lord of the World by Robert Hugh Benson if people want to read that. The first earlier dystopia, probably before H.G. Wells, it looks like. It's 1907.
That's close. Yeah, that's close. I don't know when Open Conspiracy was written. But there's another thing too. If you ever go to Galton.org, Galton, you go to Galton.org, and I don't have the screen up on me now. I'm not going to look for it. But there were like seminars or something like that on one of the drop downs. You ought to see the discussion they had back in like 1904 or something like that, where frankly, I mean, I think Galton was related to who's our friend that brought us oh man,
Galton was related to Huxley? I don't know. The Galtons and the Huxleys interbred, didn't they?
The brain is a horrible thing to lose. No, who's the one with the philosophy of evolution?
Oh, Darwin?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Isn't that pathetic? Galton, I think, was a nephew of his, Darwin, and Galton got into it with H.G. Wells, where Galton wanted selective breeding to be the answer for the world's. See, all these people are depopulationists. All right, so Galton said selective breeding, and Orwell, frankly, I'm sorry, not Orwell,
Huxley,
but no, but Wells, frankly, called him a pussy, and said to him, "Look, here's how it goes: not only selective breeding, but the killing of the hindmost, which we see as an example of genetic purity in the animal species. So basically, do what they did in Rome: is if you have a child that's handicapped, put it outside the city walls and let the wolves eat it. I'm serious as a heart attack."
No, that's definitely what the Romans did. There's no question about that. But yeah, they had a kind of a very sterile, cruel kind of philosophy. Very scary stuff. A lot of those guys, and even Huxley kind of had, he wasn't exactly, he was a tall guy because he was wealthy, but he had terrible eyesight. So he wasn't kind of like some kind of superb physical specimen, supposedly due to Darwinian ideals. But that's another story.
But the thing that Wells would come out and say that, because I always thought of him as an author, and same thing with George Bernard Shaw, who came out with that quote about, what was it in the book called, the official guide, the woman's guide to socialism or something like that, the official woman's guide. I mean, it's a really bizarre title, but that quote that comes from him is that in socialism, you would be fed and clothed and housed. And if you basically didn't get along with it, you could be killed in a kindly manner.
Wow. Yeah.
So what we're looking at today with the characters out there pushing COVID, who think they're saving the world, they know they're not. I mean,
Right.
They're all depopulationists.
Right. That's why that's why the public's not getting the best solution to the problem, if there is a problem at all, and they're getting some tainted vaccines, or I wouldn't even call them vaccines, tainted gene therapy that's probably has a higher kill rate than COVID. So it's pretty scary. Yeah, and without any oversight, without any ever any legal response, and the numbers are fake. It's really crazy.
You know, I didn't realize it would happen this quickly, and it's a brilliant stroke not to use armies for the fascism, but to use the medical field for it. And the other thing that creeps me out is the amalgamation. The same thing with monopolization. I mean, look at all the medical entities that are out there. I mean, they're just huge. I mean,
Yeah.
and I mean, I get 17 emails from them. It's like, will you get out of my life? I mean, if I have to come to you, I will. Otherwise, leave me alone. But that's not the way it's going to be. And that's what scares me the most, you know, is that you have this intrusion and you're going to have to play ball or you're going to have consequences.
Right. I mean, that's the threat coming out of Biden. That's the threat coming out of everybody. It's basically communism, forced inoculations or else, you know? Boy, that's bad. Anyway, it's a tough way to end it. What if people want to reach out to you? Do you still have kind of an email or website or anything?
No.
Okay, good. I won't put anything in there. They can email me.
Yeah.
Some people email me, and it's a good way to not get some emails. If you know what I mean. Anyway.
Well, I tell you, yeah, I mean, at this stage of the game, man, I don't need my blood pressure getting raised anymore. I mean, I don't mind people disagreeing, but one of the reasons I did get out of like the internet thing too is that there were more and more jerks. I mean, you don't have to agree with me, but I mean, just don't be so crazy. I mean, I can't tell if it's a mentally ill 30-year-old person or if it's a 12-year-old.
Right. Well, that's scary. Or it's somebody who's just a paid antagonist. You know, you don't know if somebody's just sitting in some bored hallway in India just writing nonsense. You just have no idea. So anyway, I'll let you go. Vyzygoth the Great again, talking about the communism coming to America. So anything you want to add? What's that? Yeah, it's been here.
Okay.
Been here. It's been here. Still here. It's not going anywhere, and people should be very concerned because it has different guises, right? It's the deceptive nature of it.
Exactly. And like I said, to use the medical industry for this was a really great stroke. It really was.
Awesome, man. Well, thanks so much for your time. Let's talk again soon.
All right. Take care, William.
All right. Stay there. Don't go anywhere.